housing is viewed as an asset in the United States in a way it might not be in other contexts.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're bringing you the smart conversations with people in the know that you won't hear anywhere else.
Our guest today is the ever amazing Apoorva Pasricha, and I'm just gonna recount the anecdote of how she told me to say her name: Poor in the first name, rich in the last name. So Apoorva Pasricha. So just a little background on her before we dive in. You know, she's just a huge thinker in housing innovation. She's the chief operating officer at Cloud Apartments, which we'll hear a lot about. And before that, she was the deputy director of technology and innovation for the city of San Jose, a very lovely place to be working, I imagine. Her career has been dedicated to tech and innovation, particularly in the built environment. That includes some really interesting things like autonomous cars that I hope we get to talk to in terms of her role at Zoox and other urban innovation projects. She was at Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs. She's been all over the world doing really cool things.
Yes, welcome to Housing Insiders, Apoorva. Thank you for joining us. As John said, we want to hear about cloud. We want to talk broadly about technology and innovation, especially around cities' accessibility and affordability of housing, obviously. So with that, why don't we kick off the Cloud Apartments pitch? What is it that you're working on? Why does it need to exist? Tell us first and foremost about that, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you both for having me. Very excited to be here. So, Cloud Apartments is in the modular space, specifically in industrialized construction. And Cloud Apartments exists to drive construction costs down using modular technology. And it's a company that was founded in the idea that modular hasn't historically created cost savings, which is what's prevented its widespread adoption across the country. And when we looked at why that was the case, our biggest learning was that just because you put something into a factory and make it efficient into a factory, everything that happens after that is actually what really matters. And so it's the field and the scope of the field that's really important. So even if you push boxes getting built into the factory, once they're coming on site, getting stacked, all of the work that happens after is usually where the greatest costs are. And so, if you are not looking at those and really focusing just on the factory scope, it's actually really hard to achieve cost savings. And so, Cloud was formed as a company to focus specifically on that field scope as a way to tackle the construction costs so that we can create cost savings using modular.
I think that's amazing. And I love the name Cloud Apartments because I'm often accused of having my head in the clouds. And I think when you first hear it, it's like, well, shit, if we don't have enough land, let's build them in the clouds. And I guess to disappoint listeners and people who are thinking that's what we're going to talk about, we are still building on planet Earth. You know, you guys have an amazing benefit of not being the first mover in the modular space. A lot of companies have come before you. A lot of companies have come and gone. And so you've had the chance to sort of look at what they've done and try to fix what they've done. It sounds to me like you've come to the conclusion that the reason a lot of these previous modular companies, the reason they failed is just because it ends at the factory. Do you want to say more about that? And just in terms of like, as you've looked across the industry and what's been done in the past and the failure for modular to get broad adoption, like, is that the only reason? Is that one of many reasons? Like, what have you learned as you've kind of looked across the industry?
I think it would be difficult for me to say that's the only reason. I think that there are a number of things that are contributing to what's prevented, Katera, Angtera. There's been a number of failures, as we know. We're probably in industrialized construction 3.0 is what we like to call it. I think there was a early phases of Operation Breakthrough was 1.0. Then we had another reinvigoration of the industry when Katera and these companies came up. And then I think now we're in a different era. And I think there are probably few things that really contribute to those failures. So one, this field factory piece that I'm talking about, which we can go into in a little bit, is absolutely one case. I think there are other things like what the regulatory environment has been surrounding these systems that have prevented companies from actually being successful at scaling. We actually took as a company, Cloud Apartments, we're part of the Turner Labs cohort of companies with Builders Lab. And so we went to Sweden and Scotland last year to actually see what was happening in the industrialized construction space there as a way to take learnings and see what we might be able to do differently in the US. And it really matters what is the regulatory and the financing environment around innovation when you're actually trying to build. So I think that was a second kind of core reason why things didn't work for some of these companies. I think reason that I've really seen is that the funding model for a lot of these companies in real estate is actually quite broken from my perspective, right? You had these large failures that were venture backed companies. And when you're a venture backed startup and you're taking dollars that are venture dollars and putting them towards land acquisition, that's a recipe for disaster. And so you get pressure from investors to typically grow very fast if and then you are incentivized just in a very different way. And so I think one thing we really reflected on as well outside of how was the business model broken, it's also how was the funding model for some of these companies really challenged, and how do you create funding systems that can enable companies like ours that are working in this hard assets, physical space, built environment space to actually be successful and do it in a way where we don't necessarily always have to just rely on venture capital funding. So I think those are three kind of big reasons that I've at least seen about why there were challenges in the last era of modular companies kind of going under.
That was so beautifully said. That's such a great clip. I mean, you just said that so clearly and articulately that I'm gonna keep coming back to that. That was very well said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same here. I kind of wanted to walk through each one because one of the challenges John and I run into talking to innovators and talking to the industry and trying to bridge these gaps across housing is whether something is the establishment being protectionist because they can, or there is an actual obstacle to the regulatory environment or the financing environment. So let's start with that one of the three. Do you get a sense that this is a protectionist, like a mechanism where the obstacle is the incumbents, or is it something about like the storytelling and narrative around manufacturing a house that ended up not moving the needle for lenders, financing, and local politicians? How do you think about that obstacle?
I think the obstacle around this is that housing is it's just it's a messy ecosystem. There's so many people involved. There's so, you're working with an architect, you're working with a developer, you're working with a contractor, you're working with an engineer, you're working with the city, you're working with the state. And the number of people who are involved in getting one building built is so significant. And so I think the obstacle is less just on what happens on the manufacturing side. It's just that there are barriers across the entire value chain of housing. And so, it starts from when you are applying for permits and when you're getting entitled. There isn't an incentive that allows the process to be more streamlined if you are using a faster method of construction, a faster execution of construction. Part of it is because we are based in the state of California. California has over 500 different local jurisdictions that any development that you are doing, you have to conform to those local requirements. So I think that there's an element of the building code being so localized that creates an incentive system where standardization is actually not something that's rewarded. So I think that happens. I think the second barrier, then, if you go into the actual construction process, and let's say you're using manufactured or you're using factory built housing, lenders have just been so uncomfortable with it because a lot of factories have gone under. And that has created a world where lenders are very scared about what happens if they start a project, they fund a project, and then the factory does not have enough demand to actually sustain itself and it doesn't have enough pipeline. And so that makes people really uncomfortable. And actually, that's one insight that really informed our business model as a company. So cloud is an asset asset light business model. We don't own a factory. We are actually partnering with many factories across the country because what we saw was that factories are actually quite underutilized already. If you go to a factory, typically, they their capacity that they're operating at a probably 40-50% capacity, and they what they need is demand. And some factories are doing well better than others for sure, but those factories are ones that have been around for a very, very long time. Like, some of our partners are based out of Idaho. Gurdon, Autovol are factories that have been around for over, for many, many years and have built over 200 projects. And so they are able to be exist in the ecosystem with more predictable demand. But demand is something factories really, really need. And that's been a second big barrier on the regulatory side that needs to be solved. And whether that's, a government coming in and aggregating that demand or someone else doing it. But in order for this industry to thrive, demand aggregation has to actually funnel to factories. Otherwise, factories are not going to be able to survive in the long term. So I think that's where you see on the second part of that value chain what the barrier is. And then on the third part of the value chain, that when you're actually building, one thing we actually see quite a bit is that there's a lot of tension between what the state and the local jurisdictions actually have oversight over. So in modular, we're doing volumetric modular as a company. Either there are 38 states at this point that have some version of a state level modular program. And so anything that you're building in a factory gets approved at the state level, and so you're applying for state permits, and then you're applying for city permits for anything that is at the site level. However, when push comes to shove, when you're actually in the field, you're building stuff, and local inspectors are coming in to look at what has been built, there's a tension in what they see, product that came from the factory, but they feel like it might not meet their respective local requirements, or they might say that this is not good enough. And then you have to go and do rework on that particular piece. And that adds a lot of cost on the back end. So there's no law, there's nothing that says, the state supersedes whatever's happening at the city level. And I think the state actually enforcing its authority as a superior authority is a valuable path in unblocking that regulatory side on the back end on when you're actually building. So I see the challenges all the way from permitting to actually manufacturing and then to actually building and what happens on the ground when we are doing modular development.
That's great, and you mentioned a lot of problems that, I think Jeremy and I spent a lot of time marveling at the problem, right? I mean, particularly around building codes and permitting and just the nonsensical structure that we have in this country for doing anything, and I know you guys operate more in the multifamily space. The same problem exists significantly in the single family space, which just makes it infuriatingly difficult to do anything at scale that tries to make housing cheaper. Kind of curious because like one thing that I've seen a lot of people in the modular space or at panelized space or whatever it might be, like they end up getting frustrated because there's no demand, and so they say, well, it looks like I just have to go buy some land and become the developer and the contractor and the owner and the manager. And so like ultimately they just run into this problem. And to Jeremy's point, like the incumbents have the advantage of either owning the land or having the political relationships to make the permitting process easier or whatnot. And so like that's just like, to even start contemplating building something, you got to be able to get access to the land to build something, right? And that's just hard to do. So like where are you drawing the line as a company? Like it sounds like you're not doing the factories, so that makes sense. You're kind of creating the sort of system that lets the factories go on land, if you will, if I'm stating that right. But then how far do you get into the permitting stuff? Like, are you actually going into the development, buying land, or partnering with people that are doing that?
So we have a twofold business model, and I think it actually stems from exactly that tension you mentioned, which it's something I think a lot about. It's if you want to do innovation in housing, do you have to become a developer yourself or not? And that's, I think, every company, a part of what's happened historically is that every company has realized developers tend to be first followers, not first movers when it comes to innovation. And it's understandable. They have their money on the line, right? They have their personal balance sheets on the line. So it's very understandable that that's the case. And so we've had this reflection quite a bit about what is the model that we want to work with. And we've had quite a bit of a journey as a company as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we're focusing on field innovation, and what that functionally means is that we've actually patented systems that standardize how buildings get set on site, so you don't require specialized trades to come on site to finish the work that is necessary on the back end. And so we need someone with a general license as opposed to a very specialized license. So we're really focusing on labor costs, and so that's the system that we've patented. And what we're doing with that is that system is part of our standardized designs that we do. And so we ourselves become a modular architect and a modular engineer and a modular construction manager on sites. And we find the right team. Think of us as a platform, right? We have certified partners, certified factories, certified general contractors, and we actually go as far as certified subcontractors, because subcontractors in the value chain actually are the ones that make or break whether you're going to get cost savings or not. And so we package all of that together. And what we are doing is we are doing the state permit sets when we work with our developers, and we're bringing the full team together, and we're doing the delivery through this horizontally integrated partnership model that we have. So that's the approach that we're taking. And as a company, we had first started out actually working with third-party developers. So, we have about 3,000 units that we're doing under contract that are under contract in the state of California. And of those 3,000, about 2,800 are in partnership with affordable housing developers, market rate developers, and then the other 200 are actually our own development. So we are doing self development using our own building system, and we're doing it in partnership with the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund. That's our capital partner. And actually, we're sprinting ahead for the TCAC applications that are due next week here as well. But that development is a 172 unit, fully affordable development in San Jose that's completely using our product and our system. And in this approach, what we found is that when you are doing innovation and your customer is someone else, then your ability to have them buy into the full building system is actually a lot harder than if you are a developer. With us being the developer, we have control. We have the ability to go to the factory to say, this is how we want it built. We have the ability to go to the general contractor and say, this is exactly what we want. And we have actual control, as opposed to in this other model, which is our turnkey fee for service model, where we have to do a lot through influence. And doing a lot of work through influence means we're doing a lot of change management. We're trying to bring a lot of people on board. We're trying to convince them, especially as an earlier company. And so what we found is that when we do this fee for service model, it actually takes a little bit to get the developer to get fully comfortable with using our full building system versus using elements of it as an a la carte approach. Whereas when we do our own development, obviously that's not a problem. And so I think we're taking this dual pronged approach as a way to de-risk both sides of the business, right? We wouldn't have gotten capital from a lender as a new developer for a $90 million project if we didn't have that other business model, because they wanted to underwrite a developer that has revenue coming in from somewhere else. And this tech side of the business we have, and it's de-risking the other side. And then on the development side, we're also de-risking our innovation for our future projects that we do on either side of the model. So that's the approach that we've taken, just based on what we've learned in the market and what we've seen be less successful with other modular players.
Well, and also it's a path to success just in technology generally. We use our system too, but you can use it if you want to. Watch us use it, but also feel free to adopt it. And then you get that kind of side by side as well as all those different use cases. I am curious, as you compare and contrast, you mentioned, you've written that you're faster by 50%, less expensive by 30%. And you're also, I assume, comparing your savings to their savings when you have control versus when you're supporting someone else. What are some of the other things you're seeing other than subcontractors about either the experience or lack of experience that contribute to speed and savings? If John and I wanted to spin up a developer in Detroit, Michigan, get some land and build condos here in Detroit, is this partnership something that would allow a first time developer to do everything we need to do and achieve all those savings? Or is that like road to being an experienced developer part of what makes you special and what makes them special?
It's just a
Yeah.
hypothetical question, by the way. We're not building anything in Detroit.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a good question, and I think that there are definitely characteristics in projects that enable capturing the full savings and capturing the full cost savings and also capturing the time savings. So some of the things that we've seen, first off, I think if you give me a parcel of land that you are going to develop in, I can pretty easily tell you if it's going to score high on what we've been calling the cloud scoring index. Like every site we'll look at, and we'll give it a score, and it will be an aggregation of the factors that influence if we believe it's going to see savings or not. So it starts with, are you doing? We're in the multifamily space, as Jonathan you mentioned. So are you doing a project that's at least 4 stories or taller? If you can go 5 to 7, that's ideal. Are you building in a market where cost of labor is very high because you're in a dense urban environment, or because you're actually so rural that it's going to take money to fly labor out to those areas and actually finish the job? And so it becomes expensive as a result. The third one we look at is how many units are you building? Like at the end of the day, having a unit count that's closer to 100 as a minimum starting point is actually better than going. There's a tendency to say, I want to try a small project first, and I want that project to be 30 units, 50 units, and that's great. But what that does is it actually results in you becoming a gap project for factories as opposed to being a prioritized project for factories. And so having units that are the 100 to 200, that's the sweet spot for factories as well, in order for them to give you a competitive price. So that's the third one. The fourth one is that are you building a podium project or in a slab on grade project, or are you doing a wrap product type? And what we've seen is, look, having less of a podium is generally better. You want to, maximize the residential square footage of that building because that's the modular component anyways, and so you're going to capture better savings. So we have that, and then the final thing we really look at that I think creates better cost savings or not is your design optimized for manufacturing? And what that means is that is your design built in a way that the box to unit ratio that you have is actually as low as it can be. So what I mean by that is, if you're doing a three bedroom apartment, for instance, you could build it in a few different ways with a few different layouts. And more often than not, if you are building it modularly, the default way it's built is typically with 4 boxes coming together to build a 3 bedroom. And what we are trying to do is, can we do 3 boxes with 3 bedrooms? Or can we do 2 bedrooms in 2 boxes? So let's minimize kind of the number of box count. And so those characteristics from a design standpoint actually influence cost savings pretty meaningfully. And I'd seen that more recently on a project that we were designing. Actually, we did a before and after, and it was really interesting because the developer was really focused on cost savings, as you can imagine. And by doing our exercise of designing to the cloud system, we ended up reducing the unit count by just 5%, but it reduced the box count by 20%, which means costs per unit went down by 20%. And so that ends up being pretty valuable as well. So I think, to your question, are there certain things that enable capturing those cost savings pretty meaningfully? I think there's a checklist of criteria where I can pretty easily tell, like, is this a good fit or not? Because modular is, quite frankly, not a solution everywhere. And I don't believe that it's a silver bullet to the housing crisis either. And so, how do you create the parameters so that the first project that you are doing is actually set up to achieve the cost savings? And what happens is, if you are giving me a parcel and you're saying, can you fit modular onto this, versus if I'm telling you this is the criteria that we think we should use to actually collectively find that parcel, that relationship lends itself to just greater success in achieving these cost savings.
That makes so much sense, and it's so well laid out. And hypothetically, we might send you a design and a piece of land in Detroit just so you can,
You're
you can we can really test out this. Well, first of all, let me just say, like, the 3.0 sort of framing that you gave this earlier on is just so apparent in the way that you talk through this, and it's like it's like a refreshingly intelligent way of thinking about the modular industry. And so I'm just like, it's just so well laid out, and I really appreciate how you've been able to do that. And I want to take advantage of your intelligence a little bit more, and learn from you on something that I've always been kind of curious about. So I build a modular unit in the factory, and I got to put it on the ground. And what you've really sort of talked about is like how you do that is really more. There's a lot that goes into that. And so as I think about it, it's like you've got to somehow attach it to the ground. You've got to connect electrical, you got to connect heating, plumbing. I mean, can you help me understand like all of the stuff that goes into that connection layer? What operationally is actually happening when modular units get attached to the ground?
I want to have my chief of construction officer come in and do a cameo on describing the intensely robust process. It's actually we're on a site, and I was watching him kind of do all of the work that happens after the fact. And oh my goodness, there's a lot, right? There's so much that has to happen. So once your boxes are complete, and once again, I'm talking mostly boxes because we're in the volumetric space as opposed to panelized. But they're transported to site, they're getting stacked on top of each other. Once they're stacked, someone has to come in and do all of the electrical connections, all of the mechanical connections, all of the plumbing connections from floor to floor. Someone has to come in and do all of the finishes in the corridors. And so you have a lot of trades that are kind of coming in and doing the whether it's a fire sprinkler installation, whether it's doing any of the additional hookups that happen in the actual corridor. You have trades coming into the actual units. They have to paint and repaint if things are getting messed up. And on top of that, when you can bring the boxes down, you also have to do the mainline connection. So you actually have to connect the boxes to each other as well. So think about, stitching them together. That you finish all of that, then once the building is put together, that you have to do kind of the exterior facade of it as well. And so you are spending a lot of time kind of doing that work too. You're installing elevators, you're installing any balconies that you need to. So all of that work typically ends up happening offsite. And when we actually look at it, one thing that we focused a lot on as a company has been, what is your ratio of the factory to the field in terms of hard construction costs? And in modular today, what you'll typically see is that most projects are about a third of the costs are in the factory and two-thirds are in the field. And it's exactly this process that I'm telling you about, right? That has to happen in the field. And oftentimes, and not often, more often than not, the process is not built like a manufacturing line. You have kind of people walking all over each other, right? There's no efficiency in that process, which is why we really as a company focus on this idea of how do you bring the efficiency of the factory into the field. Because if you want modular to create cost savings, that ratio has to be flipped. And to flip that ratio factory to field, you really have to focus on the innovations in the field. And so that's why all of our R&D has been focused on how do we standardize these MEP connections. How do we actually get fire sprinklers installed in the factory? How do we do facade in the factory, which is not something that's been done? And so those are the types of things that we're actually doing. So we're trying to increase the revenue for the factory so that the impact on the field is reduced time and cost in the field. And that's what we end up seeing kind of what happens on the field.
Yeah, once you're in the supply chain, you can get further and further and further along, and it can kind of spread to all of the different savings. I know too often, especially in our industry, you get this like Amazon experience that everybody asks for. We want the Amazon like this or the Amazon like that. But one of the things you just reminded me of is they got almost all the way, and in many cases all the way to the factory floor, and we got Amazon Basics or Amazon Essentials products on the site because over 20 years just kept going through the supply chain until they ended up on the factory floor. And they're like, well, we might as well put our name on it now that we've really, absorbed this whole thing. And you've made me think that way here, which is, we're going to get this wedge in and then more and more shift it over, get it out of the field and get it in to the factory. Is that, first of all, I guess my question is that the right way to think about it? And then where are we today? If you had to say, we're at the very beginning, we are at the beginning of chapter one. We've called it 3.0 here. Does that mean we're a third of the way to where you want to be? Are we, nowhere where you want to be? How are you thinking about progress how you talk to your team about progress. Where are we in that expansion?
It's a good question. We are early in the expansion. I think and I think that's shown by the data too, right? We have I kind of go back to Sweden, Scotland, Japan, some of these other countries as examples that have 85% are the numbers of like the percentage of their housing that's built using some method of offsite construction. And in multifamily for us, we're at close to 5%. So we are very, very early. And I think part of what was also incredible seeing the difference between Sweden and Scotland was Sweden felt many, many years ahead, but Scotland probably felt 5 to 10 years ahead. And it was actually really neat to see. It was really neat to see here's what you can imagine in the future, and then here's a path that is a little bit closer to where we are, but is still moving forward. And so I think we are early. California is an interesting case in the sense that there's a lot happening from a regulatory standpoint in the state of California. We have Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, who actually just hosted a housing forum in collaboration with Ezra Klein for the governor candidates, the Democratic governor candidates, specifically focused on these topics. But she went and some of our politicians went out to Sweden and Scotland to look at what's happening in the space and use that as ammunition to form a select committee on housing innovation. And that select committee did a lot of work, research with the Turner Center, and has a report that they put out saying, like, these are the things that the state needs to do. And that's turned into 6 legislative actions that the state is actually taking in expanding its own authority to do some of the back end that I was telling you about, where the state needs to be able to override what is happening at the city side, especially if it's a unit that has been inspected at the state level already. There's work around factory backstops and giving financial support to factories so that the industry can thrive. So I think that we are early, but I feel like there is an inflection point that I'm seeing in the industry in a way that hasn't been there before, because it's coinciding with this regulatory effort, which is really exciting to see, because that's the environment we saw what led to success in other countries that have clearly done this. Because it's not a new way to do stuff, right? This is I know we've been building the same way for many, many years, but the path we're proposing for building is a path that's been de-risked, it's been tested. So there's not net new in that way. And so it's exciting to kind of see that regulatory shift, which I think is going to make me say, we're not, if we were 10% today, maybe in a year, I think we'll be closer to 30, 40% because of those regulatory changes, which is exciting.
Yeah, that
That's
sounds
amazing.
amazing. Usually when we hear about California, we are taught to think higher cost. Everything will cost more, everything will be harder. The regulatory environment you mentioned is a huge change because now this portion got easier. Is it actually counterintuitively a benefit that the cost is so high for a factory in California because that's where you can show the biggest difference? Or like, should we be thinking about California factories differently than we've been told to think about the environment?
It's a good question in the sense that California factories are more expensive, right? Labor in California supersedes labor in a lot of other places, and so I think that what these bills will do is that they'll lower the total development cost. I don't think that the target is not to lower necessarily the factory portion of the cost. It's to make the factories more, to give factories more support so that they can be underwritten. But I think that the cost that it's seeking to address and the certainty it's seeking to add to the process is more on what happens on site as opposed to necessarily in the factory environment very specifically.
I want to ask a little bit more about what you've seen internationally because it comes up a lot. You know, Japan's so good and Sweden's so good, and we should be like those countries. And then I often think, well, there may be fundamentally different things about those countries that make it easier to adopt those things. And to your point, like there might be a path that we're on that some of those things can change, but some of those things might not be maybe more difficult to change than others, right? So, like I've often heard in Japan that homes are built with less intentionality to last 100 years, and so there's much more turnover of properties, and that's just a more accepted thing that you don't want a used house, you want a new house, right? Whereas here it's like you don't even think about that because you don't even have the option to get a new house. We also, and I don't really know what this means, but I've heard it enough that I'll repeat it, which is like America has very challenging and broken supply chains. Just our ability to get the underlying components for all these things is just not very good in our country relative to others. Obviously, you mentioned labor, and obviously our labor supply is different, and we have lots of rules about what kind of labor you can and can't use, and so on and so forth. And obviously, with immigration, those things change labor. And then there's just the way that people think about factory built homes versus not. So anyway, those are maybe a couple of the dimensions that I just think of off the top of my head. But outside of like the core challenges that you're solving for today, is there anything else that you see that's uniquely different about America versus some of these other countries that you haven't mentioned yet?
We had this conversation a little bit after we were, we as a team, and then also as a cohort, we were debriefing what is it that can we actually take from what we've learned, and what is the copy and paste, or yeah, what is the control C, control V here,
Yeah,
versus
yeah.
what is it that actually would need to be amended. And I think it would be remiss of us to kind of approach that uh, learning without acknowledging the fact that the political systems are also fundamentally different, that housing is viewed as an asset in the United States in a way it might not be in other contexts. It's a wealth creation asset, and so constrained supply actually is the constrained supply is what enables it to the housing environment to be what it is today, and the incentive systems are kind of warped in that sense. And so I think that's there at a fundamental level. I think the second big thing has just been, what is the role that the public sector is playing in these countries? That's just been very different as well. And I think part of what we saw outside of some of the things that you mentioned was that government chose to be an early customer of a lot of these companies in places in the countries that we were looking at, and that's not been the case here, right? Government has not necessarily seeded innovation by saying that we're going to become a customer in the United States, and that's a very different thing. But I actually think that's solvable. I think that's something that government can learn from. And so I know sometimes we talk about the idea of, can demand aggregation happen at a government level, or that's a topic, when we're talking about demand aggregation for factories, that we frequently kind of discuss. And so I think there's some learnings from like, what is the role government plays in seeding innovation, and then also helping scale it. And that's where I would say the biggest opportunities are to actually say, wait, this is something we can do here. That's one. The other thing, another big difference we saw was actually just corporations and private sector organizations are driven by sustainability related goals in the countries that we visited, at least in a way that might not be the case here, right? I remember on the trip, one of the partners that we were visiting said that they don't just care about shareholder value, they care about shared value. And that really resonated, because what that means is that when a developer is looking to test innovations, they're not doing a go no go based on just cost savings. They're saying, does this technology or does this innovation actually support my sustainability goals, or does it show me that it can actually use less materials, there's less waste associated with it? And then they believe that there's a path to cost reduction over time, because if enough groups are buying it, taking it on, then that cost savings are going to come. And so the pilot projects actually just have a different metric for success, which is such a difference in what we are doing here, right? Which is where a lot of developers here, when they've used some of these technologies, if it doesn't work on the first project, it's viewed as a failure, and then they're just more reticent to actually test it again. And so that success metric being different, I think, is the other core thing that I've seen.
I totally agree. It's this obsession. It's an obsession with measuring things in a confined spreadsheet mindset versus a more holistic mindset. And so one of the things I've been wrestling with is, if we can't get as much acceleration prioritizing, say, sustainability, can we around economic issues? So you talked a lot about this overlap of policy and innovation, policy and tech innovation. And I'm curious specifically around using, so this more holistic approach, using what you've seen in with developers and municipalities, maybe San Jose as an example, I don't know, But this idea that this is actually a job creator and an economic engine for things like recruitment for employers or things that are ancillary to the house, ancillary to the building and the unit where I live, but things that are very meaningful to politicians, meaningful to policymakers, meaningful to communities, because it's this second and third level effects. I get this building, it's a great building, it's brand new, it has all these things I wanted, and now look what's happening in that space, in that area. Can you talk a little bit about, are we on the right track with housing as an economic engine? When you talk to developers, when you talk to municipalities, is it just too far adjacent? We haven't figured out how to measure it yet. How are you seeing the policy environment, given what you said about these other countries, but here?
I think what I'm seeing are a couple of things. So that I think that argument and that conversation is most impactful, or I see it the most when we are working on projects where the developer is either a city, or an affordable housing developer, but actually mostly with more so with public land as opposed to with private land, privately owned land. So I think that that conversation's there. The second place it's there is if it's oftentimes public land as part of an RFP process. And, when you are filling out an RFP, those questions are one of the first, like you are evaluated on the economic impact of the process you're going to use or the approach you're going to take to construction on the local economy. So I think that's very valuable. That's something I see as well. So it's not there in every conversation, but I think it's there in conversation depending on where the land is being sourced from. So that's one thing I see. But I think the other part, the other things that are maybe less of a conversation and should be a little bit more are what is happening, why the workforce and workforce training and education is really valuable in the space, but specifically for manufacturing industries. I was chatting with someone who had switched from being someone who works on site to someone who works in a manufacturing environment, and we were talking a little bit about what's been different culturally and what's good about it. And manufacturing environments are safer, right? They allow for better schedules for workers. They allow for a working environment that is grounded in just in better conditions than an on-site environment might be. And so really focusing on the benefits of manufacturing environments through that lens, I think, is really valuable. And then the second piece of just, I think, labor that I've seen come up more and more in conversations is that, which is partially an economic development thing, partially a job creation thing, but we are facing labor shortages across the country. They're not going to get any better. And part of what offsite construction can do is actually reduce the amount of time that general contractors have their employees and their labor spending on site doing one job. And so it's increasing capacity, at least in the way we are approaching things at cloud. And so if you're increasing capacity, that means more jobs can be done. And so that's kind of the other jobs related angle that we've really had more conversations around. But I think that to answer kind of the question that you were getting at, most of the conversations around job creation has really been focused on where the land is coming from as the distinguishing factor in whether we're really focusing on it or not.
Fascinating. I want to have have a bit of a strange question for you. I'm gonna dig into your resume a little bit, and you were at Zoox working on autonomous vehicles, and I think for a long time, the promise of autonomous vehicles, just like flying cars, was like everywhere, and we were like, soon we will have autonomous vehicles everywhere, and sure enough, like we're starting to see them. Waymo is becoming more popular, but it's been very slow coming. And I imagine because building cars, particularly cars that can drive themselves, and dealing with the regulatory environment is really challenging. And so it's sort of again a mix of operational and regulatory challenges in that industry, which sounds very similar to this industry. So my question for you is like, did something happen to you as a kid that drew you to these like really fucked up, difficult to solve problems? That's not the question. The question is anyway. Were there lessons that you took away from autonomous vehicles that you feel like are sort of echoing into this version of your career?
Yes, I love fucked up industries. Let's start with that.
You picked the right one.
Right on,
I
yeah.
like, I honestly so I grew up really believing that I thought government was gonna be the place where I would end up, and then over my career, I've become kind of an operator at the intersection of government and private industry, and all in this broader theme of, how do you make infrastructure better? How do you make the built environment better? And when you look at all infrastructure related issues, right? I've done work, led a lot of work on broadband infrastructure, transportation, and now housing. They're all messy. They're all highly regulated environments, and I think what I really love is that when you are trying to solve big problems, I just don't believe you can do that in a silo. And you need to understand how the public sector works, what motivates each stakeholder group. And so I've just naturally been drawn to problems that have complexity with the type of stakeholders who are involved, and translating the language across those stakeholders is something I actually really enjoy doing. Like, I love that my day switches from, talking to the GC who's like, "This is what I built on site yesterday," and I was taking hammer and nails, to talking to the Turner team and talking about Buffy's bills, and then talking about how do we fund ourselves as a company, and that back and forth, and thinking about problems in such a holistic way and in a systems oriented way is something that really really excites me. So that's why I love fucked up problems and industries. To answer your
I
question.
I love the way you describe. I mean, you gave us such an elegant answer to my my poorly phrased question, but like I think you're right. Those big problems really are unique in the sense that they combine so many different stakeholder groups, and we often see people that have great ideas on modular, but they're just approaching it from that one direction. And if you are approaching autonomous cars just from the direction of like, I can build AI technology, you're just going to miss all the other dimensions of that challenge. And I think the way that you laid that out, first of all, makes a lot of sense of your career trajectory and sort of the problems you've chosen to focus on. But like, have also, I think, really pointed out something important about sort of the bigger challenges that we face as a country, which is like, how do you bring people that can really intelligently move across those different areas and solve those kind of problems?
Yeah, and I think it's a in on the Zook side of things, like there's actually quite a few parallels, right, between automotive and housing. I know, I mean, I think anytime someone thinks about modular, the first comparison that it goes to is cars. It's like, oh, if we build cars this way, why can't we build houses this way? And generally, yes, that is true. I think there's something to be said about how do we standardize, but also we live in an environment where we all have to build to local codes and all of that. So I think that that parallel is sometimes flawed, in my opinion. But the things that have been really valuable is Zoox, by virtue of being an automotive company, it demonstrated to me how important that coordination and the handoff was when the vehicle leaves the factory and a prototyping facility to when it's on the ground and a part of a fleet, and how do you make sure that the handoff between the two teams and is coordinated, and it's very clear, like what is the is this vehicle can be operated, what are the how often does it break, or there's like metrics that you're really using to govern whether something goes into the field. And I really reflect on a lot of that when we vet our factory partners, for instance. A lot of what we are solving for as a company is that coordination layer between the factory and the field, because we've seen things get built in the factory, and we've seen what happens when something goes wrong in the factory, how it impacts the field, how it creates inefficiency in the field. And so I actually see quite a bit of parallels between the handoffs from factory to field in both spaces. So that's really one thing I've seen. A second big one that I've really seen is just how do you interact with cities? I think the companies, and I remember this even when I was going to Zooks, right? One of the filters I was using to evaluate companies, and that I still do in cities, is do you view cities and do you view governments as an entity that you collaborate with, or do you have an aversion to those entities, and you are taking a I'm a tech company in the Bay Area and I'm going to just, show up and just do what I want to without having a collaborative approach. And like Zooks had such a robust training program for first responders, for different communities in the city, and I think to me it's actually a pretty big signal for about a company and how they approach these conversations with stakeholders who might think fundamentally differently from them, and might actually just be a opposed to what they're doing initially, but people how do you bring people along your journey, I think is really important. And we're doing that not just with, cities, but even these subcontractors that we're working with, these general contractors we're working with, we're doing pricing and data in a very different way. And if you just go into a meeting and say, hey, this is how we want you to do it, good luck. Like, you're never going to find a vetted part, you're never going to find a good partner at that point, and you're not going to be a good partner at that point. And so I think that the Zooks example to me was also just a really good learning around how are you approaching stakeholders who just might not think the way you do, and how are you bringing them on board. And that also translates in the day-to-day here at Cloud.
Porva, I really appreciate this conversation. It has been thrilling, honestly, to hear your perspective, your work. As you talk about this holistic approach and having to be collaborative, one of our favorite questions that we tend to end on is, what would you recommend, or what's your favorite idea that you're not working on? We do have innovators and entrepreneurs who listen to this. We have an audience across the spectrum, but especially people who want to be entrepreneurial, who want to be founders and innovators. What would be most valuable in your mind that somebody isn't working on, or what component piece, collaborative piece, do you see like that's what I would go into, or that's what I would recommend someone listening go into?
I have so many thoughts that are in my mind, and they're mostly problems that I'm facing. So I want someone to solve them for me. It's my goal.
Great.
Exactly. It's perfect.
I think one big challenge that I see on a day to day is just how is the financial ecosystem around not just offsite construction, but honestly anything innovative that's happening in housing. How does that support founders, and how does that support people just doing things differently? And right now, the way the financing ecosystem is set up, it's risk averse, right? Like, I think when lenders are doing evaluating and underwriting a project, they are doing it through it was an industry built for on-site construction. It was an industry built for traditional construction. So how do you build financial products that can take risk, but do it in a way that makes their investors feel comfortable? And how do you find the right, this goes back to the very first thing I was talking about, right? What are the funding models in this entire ecosystem? And I think that goes not only just to the founder company level, but also project level. But how do you take a bet on innovation in an industry that moves at the pace that real estate does, and requires the level of credibility that real estate does, and still give entrepreneurs and folks who are innovating in the space the ability to take a risk and actually push for solutions that might be outside the box? So I think if someone can solve kind of the financing and the funding problem here, I would be very thrilled to see that.
Here,
I
here.
love that answer. I'm so glad you gave that answer, because that's one I think a ton about, and I know a lot of our listeners do too. So I hope one of them really buckles down and tries to solve for that problem. Apoorva, thank you so much. We do a lot of these episodes, but that was truly an exceptional discussion, and I learned a ton. And I'm so impressed at what you're doing, and beyond that, just impressed at how clearly you're able to articulate the challenges. And you've left me feeling very optimistic about where the industry is going, and more specifically about what you're doing, and what Cloud Apartments is doing. So I'm excited to see what you end up doing. So thank you so much for joining.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was awesome. And I think that the industry needs a change in the narrative as well as we move forward. And I think that's what's going to push the industry forward. So it's really exciting to be a part of the optimistic conversations.
Amen to that. Well, that does it for today's episode. Thanks to everyone who's been listening in. As always, we appreciate your comments or questions or thoughts on anything. So please email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. And please also remember to subscribe and comment on all the various platforms that you're listening in on.
Share the optimism and share the brilliance of this episode so that we can keep bringing more of this to you. And thank you, as always, to Keenan Chen for our music.